Aaron here, and I am so happy that you are joining with us for our last scheduled youth event for the year. Now, we are going to be doing some things throughout the summer, so please stay tuned for some of those things as the summer begins to open up and other things like I will have more information for you. But for now, just know that there are a couple events in the work. I just don't want to announce them or dates because I'm not sure when they'll work out. But I normally don't do events over the summer, but since we've had such a horrible year of Zoom, I think it's important that we at least get some of these bigger events in over the summer, just for the fun of it. So please stay tuned for that. And if you have any ideas, I'm always open to your ideas as well. But tonight, we're going to take a break from our lesson series after this because we're going into the summer. I will have some lessons for our events. They might be on this subject or on this series we're in, or we might just do some one-offs throughout the summer and pick it back up in the fall. But tonight we're going to go out on a really important subject, and that is, can I trust the Bible? So today this is one of my favorite subjects in questions, and that's the question was, remember, working through some questions that every teen should know answers to. I would actually say not even teen, every believer should know answers to, and we've come to the question, can I trust the Bible? And I would argue that this is also a vital question that we should all wrestle with and understand. The question is the Bible true? Can we trust it? Now, I won't be able to explore this subject in its entirety, but it would be impossible to do within 20 minutes. So we will focus on the New Testament specifically today, specifically the Gospels, but even there, just in the Gospels, 20 minutes won't do it justice. So it's going to be a very flyover, scratching the surface of the subject, but it should still give you some hope and answers to this question. But I will state there is an abundant evidence, more than any other work of literature from antiquity, or that's just a fancy way to say history, for the reliability of the entire Bible. This is an essential subject for you to understand because there are many lies and misleading information, even from those who profess to be Christians out there. And if the Word of God is wrong, then all of our beliefs are in vain. This is important. The Bible was written thousands of years ago, and it makes some incredible claims. It claims that there's a God who created the universe. It claims that God sent his Son into the world to die on a cross for people like you and me. It claims that Jesus performed miracles, that he was raised from the dead and now lives within his followers through God's Spirit, and that he will come back to earth one day as a universal judge and king. These are some extraordinary claims, and we'd need some serious evidence to believe them, but they're not claims that only stupid people believe. Some of the most intelligent people alive today believe the Bible and follow what it teaches. This isn't for dumb people or people who want to believe in fairy tales. No, it's for humans, rich, poor, intelligent, uneducated, young and old. It's for everyone. So let's talk about Jesus. More specifically, did Jesus exist? This is something that some people question if Jesus ever truly existed. However, now this belief is becoming smaller and smaller. Most people, even atheists, don't doubt that Jesus existed. They believe that there is a man named Jesus. Rather, they doubt or question his divinity, his godness. But we will still answer this important question: did Jesus exist? We have both evidence from the Bible and outside the Bible, or we call it extra biblical literature, that tells us that there was a man named Jesus. These extra biblical sources are written by people who were not believers, and some even hated Christians as well, and they still wrote about Jesus, but they confirm that Jesus was truly alive. So these sources from outside of the Bible confirm that Jesus was a first century Jewish teacher, that he was crucified by the Romans during the Emperor Tiberius, who ruled between AD 14 and AD 37, and under the authority of Pontius Pilate, who was the governor of Judea between AD 26 and AD 36, and that Christians believed he was the Messiah, God's promised king, and worshipped him. We also have accounts of Jesus' life from the four Gospels. So what I just said to you was actually from non-Christian sources, but we also have Christian sources, the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which include all sorts of accurate details about the time and place in which Jesus lived. Even historians who do not believe in God at all agree that Jesus was a real person and was living during the time period that the Bible said he was living. This brings us to a logical question. Were the Gospels that we have in the Bible written too long after Jesus was alive? So were they talking about a real guy named Jesus, but just written too late so all the details are screwed up and they made him in God and deified him, but he actually wasn't claiming to be God, nor was he God? As of right now, we don't have an original copy of any New Testament letter, and that's okay. We have copies of copies, but that like I said, that's okay. We have so many copies that say the same thing, and some they vary in things that scholars can confidently say this is what the original would have said. Remember back to my chili recipe example. I'm not going to break it all down. I'll go really, really quick, but you like my chili recipe, and I write you out 3 copies of my chili recipe, and they're perfect copies, and then you 3 who received it rewrite them for your friends, but one of you spell onion wrong, the other one adds a little bit too much spicy powder, and then for centuries that's what we have. We have all these different New Testament manuscripts that are all saying the same thing with a little bit of variance. A lot of spelling mistakes are the predominant variants. The mistakes that you hear are actually just spelling mistakes. Others of them are a little bit extra added or maybe some things left out, but that should bring us hope and joy, because the fact that we have so many manuscripts, we can find those little errors that happen throughout history and say, okay, that's not what we believe, but this is what the original said. This is not something that we should worry about. We should actually be happy that they're finding these small mistakes in older copies, because it's showing us what the originals would have said. Some of the copies that we have though are very, very close to the time of the originals as well, which is fantastic. But don't let the copies of copies worry you. That's not an issue. Think of it this way. How many of you have learned about ancient history in school? Be it Greek history or Roman history, most of what you've learned has been based on copies of copies of copies of copies of things that people originally wrote down. And we have far more manuscript evidence for the life of Jesus than we do for any other living important historical figure of his time. There is so much writing on the New Testament that's all saying the same thing, and you have that nowhere else in antiquity, nowhere else in history about historical figures. And they're all saying the same thing, but yet we're taught in school facts on things of very minimal actually manuscripts. Some of them only 5 or 6, but we have thousands. So we have way more written on Jesus than any other historical figure of his time, including the emperor who was reigning during his life, Emperor Tiberius, who ruled Jesus' time. When Jesus was born, most people could not read or write. There were no computers or printers or email or cell phones. Most people learned by listening. And the disciples or students of a Jewish teacher would often know all their teachings by heart. Like you may know all the lyrics of the songs of your favorite singer or lines of your favorite movies. Some of you guys can quote Disney movies to me, and I don't even understand how you ever memorize all that. Jesus had 12 chosen disciples and lots of other followers who traveled with him. Thousands of people listened to his teachings and saw his miracles. After his resurrection, Jesus told his disciples to spread his message throughout the world, Matthew 28:18-20. At first, they did just this by the word of mouth. But when the first witnesses were starting to die out, 4 accounts of Jesus' life were written down: the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, in John. In other words, the apostles and leaders of the young church were preoccupied with broadcasting the gospel orally. They had to do it. They were on mission. There was no need to think about a written gospel at this time. The remarkable speed, you read about it in the book of Acts, right? How all of these churches were planted in record time. That's because they weren't taking time writing down. They had memorized, and all the eyewitnesses were there to hold them accountable. No, that's not what happened. And they went out and preached it everywhere they went, and it exploded. The church exploded overnight. The remarkable speed with which the good news of Jesus Christ became known throughout the Roman Empire in the first few years of church existence is the testimony to the apostles' success in the task of oral proclamation. Scholars often point to two catalysts that prompted the writing of the Gospels. First, the apostles were starting to die off, either being martyred or just dying of older age. And second, the Lord's return was evidently not going to happen within the first few decades of church existence. We have to remember a couple of things. People in that day couldn't rely on reading a book, taking notes, or even a computer or cell phone to remind them. They had to rely on their own memory and their own ability to remember, and their ability, to memorize is far superior to ours today. Actually, scientific studies are showing that our attention span is dropping. It's getting shorter and shorter because of technology. But they didn't have that problem. They had very, very good attention spans, and they had very good memories. Jewish boys would memorize the entire 5 books of the Old Testament time they became adults. So the apostles knew that most couldn't read, and it would take time to write it all out, and they wanted everyone to know the gospel. So in the early years, the church grew by oral proclamation and not by written letters, which is why we see a gap between the Christ's life and death in the writings of the gospel. This isn't because they were waiting. This is because it had to be a gap because they were preaching it everywhere they went. But as I state, as people began to get older and die off, the apostles didn't want the message to be changed. Because once they died off, and once all the eyewitnesses died off, it could be changed. So they wrote it during their life and wrote it during the life of the eyewitnesses. They started to grow in their understanding that Jesus wasn't coming back in a month or a year, which is why they worked so hard in the beginning, because they thought Jesus was really coming back. It's kind of like Jesus said, BRB, be right back, and so they thought it's imminent, it's coming. He's going to be here next week. You all need to know the gospel. But as they began to realize his return wouldn't happen in their lifetime, obviously, because here we are, they began to write down the gospel message for future generations so it wouldn't be changed. We shouldn't be scared about this gap. This gap is here because they were writing it down because they realized it would be changed once they died. Each one of the Gospels has its own reasons for being written, when it was written, and to whom. But the fundamental point that the oral proclamation of the Gospel was a primary concern to the leaders of the church in the first few decades is vital to remember. But what kind of delay are we actually talking about? How long did it take for the 4 Gospels to be written? Most scholars regard Mark as the first Gospel, written no later than the 60s. Not the 1960s, but literally just 60, okay? This is early, 60s. If Jesus died in 30 or 33, there's some debate between those two dates, but we won't get into that. Then the first Gospel would have been written within 4 decades of the death of Jesus Christ. Or let's say it this way. Jesus died in 30 and Mark was written in 60. That's only a 30-year gap. Even if Mark was written this late, there would have been plenty of eyewitnesses still living to confirm the truth of what he wrote. But there is significant evidence to suggest that he wrote earlier than this. Significant evidence. First, if Luke used Mark to write his gospel, which is commonly believed, as most scholars believe, then Mark, of course, must have been written prior to Luke's gospel. Second, Luke is in reality the first volume of a 2-volume work, Acts. If you didn't know that, Luke wrote both Acts and Luke. And Luke started as the first volume and Acts was the second volume. They're written to the same people. Acts is the second volume, and there is increasing evidence that Acts was written in the early 60s. Prior to Paul's trial in Rome. After all, the book begins with a bang but ends with a whimper, dragging on for chapter after chapter in anticipation of this trial that never comes. We never actually read of the trial in there. So most scholars agree that it was written in the 60s because of that. But if Acts is meant in part as some sort of trial brief, then the reason it doesn't get to the trial makes sense. Third, the Olivet Discourse, in which Jesus predicts the destruction of Jerusalem, which is found in Mark 13, many scholars simply deny the possibility of true prophecy in the Bible, and hence they demand that Mark be written after 70, as well as Matthew and Luke. But Robertson, a New Testament scholar, in redating the New Testament, made the interesting case that the prophecy in Mark 13 actually argues for a date prior to 66. He points out that the specifics of the Olivet Discourse do not altogether match what we know of the Jewish war, what was taking place. That's what most people say it's prophesying about. Basically, in layman's terms, the prophecy doesn't match what happened in the fall of Jerusalem when Rome sacked it. So we need to stop trying to suggest that Mark was written later because of this. Robertson is correct that the prophecy in Mark 13 was not fulfilled exactly as it was recorded. But whether the Jewish war is all that was envisioned in the prophecy is a different matter than what we're talking about today. Nevertheless, his fundamental point is solid, increasing the likelihood that Mark was written prior to 70 and even prior to 60. What all this means was Matthew and Luke simply that two were most likely written before 70. Again, the two basic reasons to argue this is that one, Luke is the first volume of Luke Acts, and Acts most likely written in the early 60s, and two, the argument that the Gospels must be written after 70 because a predictive prophecy is impossible backfires in the Olivet Discourse recorded in all the Synoptic Gospels, and the Synoptic Gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke, since the prophecy was not completely fulfilled at that time. But without boring you anymore with all that, with all the arguments, there is good reason to believe that Mark, being the first gospel written, was actually written in the 50s, only 20-ish years after the crucifixion. This is important because all eyewitnesses, or at least most, would still be alive to say, no, Mark, that's not what Jesus said or did. They were trying to make, they weren't trying to make anything up. They stated facts, and the thousands who heard Christ preach and saw his miracles can confirm their facts. In a book called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, which is a great book, a world-class New Testament scholar, Richard Bauckham, gives us evidence that these Gospels are based on eyewitnesses' accounts. He points out that the writers often mention the names of people they had talked with or talked to, that anyone reading the Gospels would know whom to ask for accuracy in the writing. Hey, it'd be like me saying, if you don't believe me, go and ask so-and-so. They saw it with their own eyes. Like if I told you, hey, there was this Godzilla walk through Drumheller the other day, and you'd be like, yeah, right. I'm like, no, seriously, go ask so-and-so, so-and-so, and so-and-so. They saw it as well with their own eyes. This is the same thing that we're getting at here. To test this, go and ask your grandparents and ask them a highlight of their younger years, something good, maybe even something bad, something that really stuck in their memory, something funny that happened or amazing or even embarrassing, and then listen to the story and then ask your parents if they've ever heard that story before. And I'm sure they have. And if it's a highlight, they'll be able to confirm that they were told the same story in the same way. And if your grandparents are in their 70s or older and can still tell the story, and that's longer than most Gospels were written after the crucifixion of Jesus. So what I'm getting at is this gap is not a concern because everyone was still alive who witnessed Christ, and the memory gap is not large. Just like we can retell stories from our childhood, and your grandparents can still retell stories from their childhood with accuracy. So all those stories from our parents or grandparents are fun and great to listen to. They are still different than the accounts of Christ. The teaching of Jesus and the things he did were really, really important. Lots of people were watching and lots of people were listening to Jesus. He changed people's lives dramatically, and many of those people were willing to face execution, death, for telling others about Jesus. The Gospels were written to make sure that the stories about Jesus would still be told accurately after the eyewitnesses have died and could not be consulted anymore. Jesus' followers didn't want the stories about Jesus to be changed. They were too important. And after we see all the eyewitnesses die, after we see all the apostles die, that's when we start seeing some weird writings coming out, and we know they're wrong because they're written way too late. So thank God they wrote down these eyewitnesses' accounts because they were trying to be changed. But since the originals were written and copied, we could fundamentally find the errors in the other ones. So that brings me to a question is, what if people made up the stories of Jesus? First, the most crazy sounding claim in the Gospels is Jesus' resurrection, right? Okay, I can get by with some healing. Maybe he did some magic potion work or something like that and made people feel better and they weren't actually healed. But resurrection, like raised from the dead, that's pretty wild. And you might make up that your hero had risen from the dead if you thought that you'd get lots of attention or make lots of money from a story like that. But if people might kill you for saying that, you probably would stop, right? Many of Jesus' first followers were beaten and killed for saying that very thing. You see, nobody's going to die for a lie that they know is a lie. So you might counter me, well, other people die for other religions. Yeah, but they think that it's truth. We're talking about the guys who would be the authors of this lie. They clearly know they're making it up, and yet they died for it. These eyewitnesses would clearly know that this didn't happen, and yet they're saying it and dying for it. That doesn't happen. The lie would come out with that many people involved. It's not one or two, it's hundreds and hundreds of people who are saying the same thing and dying for the same thing. Nobody's going to die for something they know is truly a lie. Second, the stories in the gospel are really embarrassing for the disciples. They don't make them look good. Peter is one of Jesus' closest followers, a key leader in the early church. Experts believe that Mark's gospel was based actually on Peter's memories of Jesus. Mark tells us that Peter had promised that he'd stick with Jesus even if everyone else ran away. And you see that in Mark 14:29-31. So far, so good for Peter. But Mark also says that on the night that Jesus was arrested, Peter claimed 3 times that he didn't know who Jesus was. Mark 14:66-72. If I were Peter, I wouldn't want people to know that part of the story unless it really happened. And I thought that telling the truth about Jesus was more important than what people thought of me. I definitely wouldn't make it up or let other people make it up a story like that about me and spread it around. That look at this coward. He said he was faithful, but wasn't. No. Third, some people argue that as years went by, more and more crazy stories were made up about Jesus. But the earliest writings we have about Jesus, some of the New Testament letters, talk about his resurrection. And this is his most amazing miracle. If people were exaggerating about Jesus over time, you would expect the most crazy sounding stories to come last. But the resurrection claim is the earliest writings about Jesus that we have. And if you think about it, if Jesus really was raised from the dead, it's not so crazy to believe that he also healed people, walked on water, or stopped storms. But what if the disciples truly thought Jesus had been raised to life, but in fact, he just didn't die in the first place? What if Jesus didn't really die? In the classic comic film, The Princess Bride, the hero Wesley gets tortured to death, but his friends make him to see, friends take him, to see a man called the Miracle Max. After inspecting Wesley's body, Max reassures them that it just so happens that your friend here is just mostly dead. He's not fully dead, he's mostly dead. There's a big difference between mostly dead and all dead. Mostly dead is slightly alive, but by the end of the day, thanks to Max's miracle pill, Wesley is alive enough to fight his enemies in the end. Some people wonder if Jesus wasn't all dead after he was crucified, but just mostly dead, so that after a few days, he revived himself. But Roman soldiers knew how to kill. They don't mess that up. In fact, they often had the job of crucifying people who claimed to be God's Messiah. This wasn't the first time. Crucifixion, the method used to kill Jesus, was designed to maximize pain and to leave the victim not just mostly dead, but all dead. We saw back in one of my last messages, I can't remember which one it was, that if Jesus that Jesus was either raised from the dead or he was not, and that different religions disagree about whether or not he was raised. So is there any evidence to think that Christianity is right and that Jesus truly came back to life? So let's see. Is there any evidence? I just want you to think kind of loosely here about the pandemic we're in right now. If you told me back in 2019 that we would go through what we have in the past year and a bit, I would have not believed you. I wouldn't have believed you. This virus started across the world in one community and spread from the country to country to country at a crazy speed. Some people don't even believe this virus to be true because they can't see it without a microscope, but the evidence is there. Thousands have died. And Jesus, loosely, is somewhat like that. But instead of the terrible news of death, he spreads the wonderful news of life. And it spreads at a rapid speed. It's contagious. People doubt it. though, in spite of all the evidence we have both today and from history. Jesus' disciples weren't expecting him to be raised after his crucifixions. They were very upset and they were scared. As we saw earlier, Jesus' most enthusiastic disciple, Peter, was so scared after Jesus was arrested that he couldn't even admit that he knew who Jesus was. Then 3 days after Jesus' death, some of his female followers said that they'd seen Jesus alive. You see that in all the Gospels there. And at that time, people didn't take what women said very seriously. So if you were trying to make up a convincing story, you definitely wouldn't have women be the first witnesses, okay? I don't believe that. But back in the day, that's true. Women were just property. They weren't considered to be believable. And the fact that the Gospels put women as the first ones to be the proclamators, the preachers of Jesus being alive is very, very interesting and very, very significant. You wouldn't put that in there if you're making this story up. It would be like me making up a story today and saying that you heard it from a bunch of young, toddlers or 5-year-olds. Not that I'm thinking that women are on the same level, but that's what they did back then. And the only reason that the gospel would say that women were the first witnesses of Jesus' resurrection was if they really were the first witnesses. What's more, if the Roman and Jewish authorities had produced the body of Jesus, they could have proven that Jesus hadn't been raised, but they couldn't. They couldn't produce his body, turning a few scared disciples who had abandoned Jesus when danger came into people who were willing to give their lives for proclaiming that he had been raised from the dead, and it took a miracle to get them there. And that miracle happened. Jesus' male and female followers started passing the message on until it was all around the world. They proclaimed that Jesus had died for our sins, taking the punishment we deserved, and that he had been raised from the dead to give us new life. For the last 2,000 years, this new life has been spreading from person to person as people have heard the good news about Jesus and believed in who he was and what he said. Unlike a virus, this new life can't be seen under a microscope. We can't prove it beyond a doubt that the resurrection happened. I can't show you any scientific facts or anything like that, but we can see the effects of it all over the world. And if you think about it, if there is a God who made the universe and gave us life in the first place, it's not that crazy to think that God could raise someone from the dead. The Bible claims that Jesus literally rose from the dead. His physical body came back to life. He talked and walked and ate with his disciples. And to be a Christian, you need to believe that this is literally true. Amen. Well, I hope that gave you a little bit of hope that the Bible, that leather-bound Bible you hold in your hands, although it has a lot of history behind it, is the same words that were penned down back in 2,000 plus years ago. You can trust it. This was a scratch on the surface. There's so much evidence that works in our favor, that the Bible has not been changed and it's not full of errors. You'll hear that all the time. It's full of errors. Yeah, a lot of spelling errors, but there's no major errors that change the theology. There's a couple spots that have been caught, and we realize that from changing throughout history, but that should bring us hope and not worry, because we caught it, because we have so much literature saying the same thing, that when those 2 or 3 popped up saying something different, it's like red light, error. And so we caught it, and those are open for anyone. We don't hide that. We know that. The longer ending of Mark is one of them. Mark is actually believed to end a little shorter. There's a whole little section there that's been added on that would not be in the original manuscripts. Anyways, even though reading the longer ending of Mark, which is interesting, doesn't change anything theologically about the life of Jesus or his death or his atoning work. So you can rest assured in that. So be blessed. I'll see you on Zoom. Just going to switch some locations around here, and then I'll let you all in. All right. See you guys soon. Bye.